The year is 1985. In a cramped hospital ward in Kinshasa, nurses struggle to comfort patients wasting away from a disease no one fully understands. Rumors spread faster than the illness itself. Mothers whisper in fear. Families keep their distance. And then, quietly at first, a new explanation begins to circulate, not in the halls of science, but in the pages of obscure newspapers and whispered through radio stations. It is not a virus born of nature, they say. It is a weapon, an American weapon, crafted in secret laboratories, unleashed to target the world. What began as a planted story, a single poisonous seed, would metastasize across continents. It would sow distrust, ignite conspiracy, and brand a deadly epidemic as the creation of a hidden enemy. It would take root in the minds of millions long before fact could catch up. This was not an accident. It was an operation, a carefully engineered campaign, and it carried a name that sounds almost like a warning itself: Operation INFEKTION. The question that haunts us still is not only why this campaign was launched, but how much damage it did before the truth could ever hope to catch up. The Cold War was fought on many fronts. Nuclear arsenals stood ready in silos, armies lined up across borders, and spies stalked the shadows of divided cities. But there was another battlefield, one that was invisible, insidious, and every bit as dangerous: the war for information. In this war, truth itself became a weapon. Words could wound more deeply than bullets, and a single rumor could do what armies could not: weaken an enemy from within. It was in this shadow theater that the Soviet Union's intelligence services devised one of their most audacious operations. They called it Aktivnie Meropryatiya, active measures, covert campaigns designed not to steal secrets, but to plant lies. Among these operations, one stood apart: a campaign designed to weaponize fear, to exploit the terror surrounding a mysterious new disease ravaging communities around the world. The claim was simple, devastating, and impossible to ignore: that AIDS was not a natural illness at all, but a man-made plague unleashed by the United States. What you're about to hear is the story of how that lie was planted, how it spread across continents, and how it poisoned trust for decades. A story hidden in archives, whispered about in intelligence circles, and denied at the highest levels until the evidence could no longer be buried. In this episode, we'll uncover how Operation INFEKTION began, the machinery that drove it, and the devastating impact it left behind. Because this wasn't just about a rumor, it was about rewriting reality itself and shaping the fears of a generation. But to understand how such a story could take hold, we must first step back into the world before it began. A world already drowning in paranoia, mistrust, and the suspicion that every shadow concealed a hidden hand. And before we dive in, I'd love to know from you, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now as you listen? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy seeing the global community that gathers here. Now, let's begin. The Cold War was more than a clash of armies or ideologies. It was a war of shadows, a conflict waged in the hidden spaces where perception mattered more than firepower. By the late 1970s, both superpowers had entered a period of exhaustion. The United States was emerging from Vietnam scarred, its global image tarnished, its citizens questioning government authority in ways unseen since the Depression. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, struggled beneath the weight of economic stagnation, overextension, and the creeping awareness that its promise of prosperity had turned into a prison of shortages and suspicion. Neither side could afford an open war, and so they fought with whispers, with rumors, with stories crafted to wound without leaving fingerprints. For the Soviet Union, this craft was centuries old. The Tsarist secret police had planted forgeries and fables to discredit their enemies. But under the KGB, disinformation became a weapon honed to surgical precision. They called it Aktivnie Meropryatiya, active measures. It was more than propaganda. It was the deliberate planting of falsehoods in the soil of truth, carefully nurtured until they grew into undeniable weeds, choking the minds of millions. Forged documents, staged scandals, whispered conspiracies, these were the hidden artillery of Moscow's political war. In the 1970s, these tactics took on new urgency. The nuclear balance made direct confrontation unthinkable, but the Soviets realized they could achieve strategic victories without firing a shot, if they could only undermine trust in the West. And so, they experimented, targeting newspapers in Africa, India, and Latin America with fabricated leaks about American plots. They forged NATO documents showing plans for preemptive strikes. They whispered that the CIA ran drug cartels, that American diplomats carried out assassinations, that Western medicine itself could not be trusted. To the casual reader, these stories seemed outlandish, but repeated often enough, echoed across sympathetic outlets, they began to stick. The United States, for its part, understood the game but struggled to counter it. Disinformation operated in the gaps between fact and perception, and in an age before the internet, before real-time debunking, a lie could travel continents before the truth even stirred. By the time American officials prepared a denial, the story had already seeped into speeches, sermons, and whispered fears. And in many parts of the world, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, there was already fertile ground. Centuries of colonial exploitation, CIA coups, and Western arrogance had left deep scars. If someone claimed Washington was behind a new atrocity, why would it be so hard to believe? And then, into this atmosphere of suspicion and fear, came something far more terrifying than any rumor, a disease without name, without cure, and without mercy. The first reports trickled in during 1981. In Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York, doctors began seeing young men arriving at hospitals with rare infections: pneumocystis pneumonia, Kaposi's sarcoma, illnesses usually confined to the elderly or the severely immunocompromised. But here they were, in men in their 20s and 30s, wasting away. One doctor described it bluntly: they looked as though they had aged 30 years overnight. No one knew what it was. They only knew that once the symptoms appeared, death followed swiftly. By 1982, the Centers for Disease Control gave it a name: Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome, AIDS. The public was terrified, but also confused. At first, it was linked almost exclusively with gay men, leading to stigma, fear, and cruel jokes. But then it appeared among hemophiliacs, among drug users, among heterosexual partners. The fear widened. Parents worried about their children. Patients feared blood transfusions. Communities whispered about contagion. The disease carried not only physical devastation, but also social exile. Fear, stigma, and mystery, the perfect conditions for suspicion. And in the minds of Soviet strategists, the perfect conditions for a weaponized lie. But before the idea took shape, the Soviet bloc had been experimenting with biological themes for years. In the late 1960s and 70s, KGB operatives circulated rumors that the United States had tested biological weapons in Vietnam and Korea. Pamphlets and forged reports claimed American planes had dropped plague-carrying insects, that laboratories in Maryland experimented on prisoners with lethal viruses. These stories rarely reached Western headlines, but they spread like wildfire in countries already suspicious of Washington. African leaders repeated them in speeches. Asian newspapers published them as fact. Each rumor, however unbelievable, chipped away at the credibility of the United States. By the early 1980s, Soviet intelligence recognized that science itself could be weaponized in the realm of disinformation. Unlike a political scandal, which could be denied or explained away, a scientific conspiracy carried an aura of expertise. Ordinary citizens unfamiliar with the language of virology or genetics were vulnerable to pseudoscientific explanations dressed up in technical jargon. If a rumor carried just enough scientific terminology, just enough supposed expert testimony, it could feel plausible, and plausibility was all it needed to take root. It was around this time that the Soviet Union's ally, East Germany, began playing a key role. The Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, ran one of the most sophisticated propaganda and intelligence networks outside the KGB itself. East German scientists, some genuine, others manufactured, provided the illusion of academic backing for Soviet campaigns. They could write papers, issue reports, and feed data into the global information stream under false names or controlled outlets. In the chessboard of disinformation, East Germany became a crucial bishop, less visible than Moscow, but able to move in ways that gave the operation credibility. So when AIDS emerged, mysterious, terrifying, and already stigmatized, it offered an irresistible opportunity. Here was a disease no one understood. Here was an epidemic already associated with secrecy, shame, and government silence. And here was a chance to strike at the very heart of American credibility, not with a bullet, not with a bomb, but with a rumor so devastating it could not be contained. The genius of disinformation is not in inventing the unbelievable, but in amplifying what people already fear. In the early 1980s, people feared AIDS. They feared it was contagious in ways not yet understood. They feared their governments were not telling the whole truth. They feared the shadow of biological warfare, whispered about since World War II, had finally arrived. Into that fear, the KGB would soon pour a story designed to twist suspicion into certainty that AIDS had been created in a laboratory at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the same U.S. Army facility long associated with biological research. But in these early years, before the rumor had been born, the world was already primed to believe it. And in Moscow's Lubyanka headquarters, where the KGB's vast bureaucracy churned through files, reports, and psychological analyses, senior officials began to ask a question that would reshape the Cold War battlefield. If fear itself could be weaponized, how far could a single lie go? Disinformation in the Soviet imagination was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy of power. In a system built on secrecy, truth was always negotiable, malleable, and disposable when it served the state. By the time Yuri Andropov rose to prominence as KGB chairman in the 1960s, he recognized that Soviet tanks could never roll freely across Western Europe without sparking catastrophe, but Soviet lies could march unhindered into newspapers, parliaments, and living rooms. He cultivated departments within the KGB dedicated entirely to fabrications. By the 1970s, Department A of the First Chief Directorate existed for one purpose: planting stories designed to erode confidence in the West. The scope of their projects was staggering. They forged U.S. government cables suggesting the CIA assassinated African leaders. They invented proof that American military labs conducted chemical tests on prisoners. They distributed leaflets in the Third World claiming the Pentagon had unleashed earthquakes and floods with weather control weapons. Most of these claims seemed bizarre to Western audiences, but the goal was not to persuade everyone. It was to persuade enough people in enough places that Washington became synonymous with untrustworthiness. Even if the truth eventually emerged, the damage was already done. Suspicion lingered long after a lie was debunked. American officials recognized the problem, but their tools were clumsy. The United States Information Agency tried to counter Soviet propaganda with its own messaging, but it was difficult to fight shadows with official press releases. When a forgery appeared in a small African newspaper, alleging that the CIA spread cholera in Bangladesh, what could Washington do? Issue a denial, which would seem defensive? Ignore it and watch it spread? The dilemma was unsolvable. A U.S. embassy officer in Africa once admitted, by the time we got around to denying a story, it had already been quoted in 20 other papers. The damage was done. And then came the context of science itself. The 1970s and early 1980s were years of extraordinary promise in biology, but also years of unease. Scientists mapped viruses with unprecedented precision. Genetic engineering, once the realm of fantasy, was becoming reality. At the same time, the memory of secret U.S. programs like MK-Ultra and Tuskegee lingered. When people heard whispers of laboratories experimenting with diseases, it wasn't so easy to dismiss them. If the government had hidden unethical experiments before, why couldn't it be hiding something worse? In the Soviet bloc, strategists understood this perfectly. They studied not just military reports, but also sociology, psychology, even anthropology. They knew that people feared what they did not understand, and that disease was among the oldest and deepest fears of all. Rumors of poison wells had triggered pogroms in the Middle Ages. Colonial powers had faced accusations of spreading plague among native populations. In South Africa under apartheid, rumors circulated that the regime was using science to sterilize black citizens. To weaponize disease in rumor form was to tap into something ancient, visceral, and almost impossible to eradicate. Meanwhile, AIDS was spreading with terrifying speed. By 1983, French researchers at the Pasteur Institute had isolated the virus later named HIV. But outside laboratories, public understanding lagged. In New York, panic gripped neighborhoods where patients were ostracized. In San Francisco, doctors faced harassment for treating those infected. In Africa, the disease spread through blood transfusions and sexual contact, but without the infrastructure to test or treat, it advanced unchecked. Leaders demanded answers from the West. What was this sickness, and why was it striking so fiercely? Into this cauldron, Soviet intelligence prepared its move. But it wasn't just opportunism, there was calculation. AIDS, they realized, could be tied directly to a symbol already notorious in the developing world, the U.S. Army's Fort Detrick in Maryland. For decades, Fort Detrick had been home to America's biological warfare program. Even though the United States officially ended offensive bioweapons research in 1969, the name Fort Detrick carried an aura of secrecy and menace. To whisper that a virus had escaped from there, or worse, been created there, was to make a lie instantly believable to those already predisposed to doubt American intentions. Before AIDS, the Soviets had tested this formula. In the 1970s, they circulated forged documents claiming the Pentagon had developed Ebola as a weapon. They alleged that swine flu outbreaks in Cuba were the result of American sabotage. Each time, the accusation made headlines in sympathetic nations, and each time, Washington's denials seemed pale and unconvincing. A Cuban farmer who watched his pigs die didn't care about official statements. A Ghanaian newspaper reprinting a Soviet-supplied article didn't wait for scientific confirmation. The KGB learned a vital lesson. In the global South, where colonial wounds ran deep, accusations against the West found fertile soil. For many African leaders, the idea that the West might unleash a disease was not fantasy. It was entirely plausible. They had lived through centuries of exploitation, from slavery to medical neglect. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, in which black men in Alabama were deliberately left untreated so doctors could observe the course of the disease, was well known across Africa. If the U.S. government could betray its own citizens in such a way, why not unleash a virus on foreign populations? The Soviets didn't need to invent suspicion, they only needed to channel it. Inside Moscow, the machinery of active measures began aligning. Department A worked with counterparts in East Berlin to craft the outlines of a campaign. They would need obscure but credible outlets to publish the first seeds. They would need scientific backing, ideally from sympathetic doctors or fabricated studies. And most importantly, they would need patience. Disinformation was not a single blow, but a campaign of attrition. A lie planted in 1983 might not bear fruit until 1985 or 1986, but once it did, it would be unstoppable. At the same time, American institutions were ill-prepared to respond. In Washington, attention was fixed on nuclear arms talks, the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and proxy conflicts in Central America. AIDS itself was a politically charged subject, stigmatized by its association with homosexuality and drug use. President Reagan did not publicly utter the word AIDS until years into the epidemic. This silence created a vacuum. In that vacuum, alternative narratives, however implausible, began to thrive. Consider the perspective of a young African doctor in 1983, treating patients with mysterious symptoms. The drugs available were ineffective. International aid was minimal. American officials offered scientific jargon, but little relief. If a newspaper in India or a pamphlet from East Berlin suggested the disease was engineered by the CIA, the claim did not seem outrageous. It seemed like a possible explanation for the suffering unfolding before their eyes. Truth was fragile, and suffering demanded answers. The Soviets also had another motive beyond propaganda. AIDS was devastating the West, particularly the United States. If the disease could be reframed not as a tragedy, but as a crime, then Washington's moral authority would crumble further. Moscow could claim the high ground, painting itself as the defender of humanity against an America willing to experiment with genocide. It was a narrative too powerful to resist. So the planning began, not with guns or bombs, but with drafts of articles, with forged documents, with memos instructing operatives to identify sympathetic journalists in the developing world. The first target would be an English-language newspaper in India. It was small enough not to draw immediate scrutiny, but large enough to reach international audiences. A story would appear, citing anonymous sources and supposed leaked documents, claiming that AIDS was the product of U.S. military experiments. The article would be crafted not as wild conspiracy, but as sober revelation, filled with scientific-sounding phrases. Once published, it could be cited elsewhere, quoted in other newspapers, and eventually find its way back into African and European media. From there, the lie would live a life of its own. But in 1983, all of this was still a plan, still whispers in offices, still drafts on typewriters in smoky rooms in East Berlin and Moscow. What the world saw instead was confusion. American doctors struggling to define the syndrome, French researchers racing to isolate the virus, African leaders demanding answers as villages buried their dead, Western governments silent or hesitant. And within that silence, a storm was forming. The Soviet Union had long searched for a weapon that could undermine the United States without triggering open conflict. They believed they had found it, not in missiles, not in armies, but in the very air of rumor and the fear of disease. The world before Operation INFEKTION was a world already primed to believe the unbelievable. And as the first drafts of the campaign circulated through KGB channels, one chilling question loomed over Lubyanka Square. If a single lie could take root in the terror of an epidemic, what damage might it unleash once it escaped into the world? It began not with a roar, but with a whisper. In July of 1983, readers of a little-known Indian newspaper, The Patriot, stumbled across a curious article. It was small, tucked between other stories, and it bore the anonymous certainty of a piece written by someone who claimed to know more than they should. The headline suggested something dark, that the deadly new disease called AIDS was not the work of chance, but of man. Not the hand of nature, but the design of science, American science. On its face, it looked almost absurd, a fringe story, easy to dismiss, but behind it lay a careful calculation. This was not the work of an eager journalist chasing sensation, nor of a paranoid reader sending in a tip. It was a seed planted by the KGB's machinery of disinformation, an experiment in what they called active measures. The article claimed that AIDS had been manufactured at the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Lab at Fort Detrick, Maryland. It was, the piece alleged, a weapon gone wrong, perhaps unleashed intentionally against marginalized communities, or perhaps spread by accident. The Soviet playbook was precise. Never shout the lie, but whisper it in places where it might be overheard. Plant the story in a foreign press outlet, preferably one outside the immediate line of Soviet control. The Patriot fit the bill perfectly. India, while officially non-aligned in the Cold War, was a nation with deep ties to Moscow and a receptive ear for stories that painted Washington in a darker shade. To the KGB, it was fertile ground. At first, the article caused barely a ripple. It passed quietly through the news cycle, dismissed as a strange curiosity by most. But the KGB knew their tradecraft. Disinformation was not about the immediate splash. It was about the echo. Once published, the story could be cited by others. Other outlets could point to the Patriot as a source, and soon the echo would sound like a chorus. What began as a single article would, over time, grow into a refrain too loud to ignore. By 1985, the world was growing increasingly terrified of AIDS. Hospitals in New York, San Francisco, and Kinshasa overflowed with patients. Families were shattered, communities stigmatized. The disease carried not only a physical toll, but also a social one: fear, shame, suspicion. Few understood how it spread, and even fewer trusted what they were told. Into this atmosphere of panic, the Soviet campaign injected its poison. The second step came in the form of repetition. Soviet-backed outlets began to cite the Patriot piece, carefully framing it as if they were reporting a troubling claim rather than endorsing it outright. In East Germany, the Stasi picked up the thread, weaving it into their propaganda streams. Radio Moscow began hinting at the possibility that American scientists had engineered the virus, suggesting that marginalized groups, homosexuals, black communities, and even populations in Africa had been chosen as test subjects. The narrative took on a sinister undertone. Perhaps AIDS was never meant for the American public at all. Perhaps it was a weapon intended for the developing world, a biological bomb aimed at Africa. And Africa listened. By 1986, the story had begun to circulate widely across the continent. Newspapers in Tanzania and Zaire reprinted versions of the claim, citing the Indian article as evidence. The mechanics of the lie were working exactly as intended. Now, the KGB could point to African newspapers as independent validation, obscuring their own fingerprints. Each retelling distanced the story from its Soviet origins, until it seemed to have a life of its own. For African leaders grappling with a terrifying epidemic, the theory had a chilling logic. How else could one explain a disease so new, so deadly, and so devastating? Western medical aid came, but so did suspicions. Doctors sent by the U.S. were eyed warily. Vaccines were refused. Trust began to fray, exactly as Moscow had hoped. In Washington, intelligence analysts began to pick up the threads. Reports trickled in from embassies and CIA field stations, stories of African officials who believed AIDS might be a U.S. plot. The claims were dismissed at first as fringe paranoia, but then the U.S. State Department noticed something disturbing. Soviet-backed outlets were quoting scientists from around the world who had supposedly confirmed the theory. In reality, many of these scientists were fabricated, their quotes invented. Others were real figures whose words had been twisted, mistranslated, or ripped from context. The Soviet press would cite an obscure biologist in Africa or a doctor in Eastern Europe, attributing statements they never made. The result was a fog of plausibility. Each piece looked like a genuine news item. Together, they built a narrative that was nearly impossible to refute. The genius and the danger of Operation INFEKTION was not that it convinced everyone, but that it convinced enough. Enough to spread doubt, enough to undermine trust, enough to make governments hesitate before partnering with Washington on public health initiatives. As the rumor metastasized, the machinery behind it became more brazen. Soviet bloc newspapers began running editorials openly accusing the United States of genocide. Pamphlets circulated in African universities, warning students that the epidemic sweeping through their countries was not an accident, but an act of war. In some cases, these pamphlets arrived with uncanny precision, distributed just as outbreaks flared in nearby regions. The timing was no coincidence. It was orchestration. Meanwhile, Radio Moscow amplified the story in dozens of languages, broadcasting across continents. The lie became so widespread that even in the United States, fringe groups began to repeat it. Among communities already distrustful of the government, African American activists, conspiracy theorists, anti-establishment movements, the idea found fertile soil. At rallies and in underground newspapers, whispers turned to declarations. AIDS was no disease of nature, it was a government weapon. By the mid-1980s, what had begun as a single article in The Patriot had grown into a storm. The rumor was now so firmly entrenched that the Soviets no longer had to push it. It had taken on a momentum of its own. Every repetition, every frightened conversation, every suspicious glance at an American aid worker carried the operation further. And yet, the architects in Moscow were not satisfied. The KGB wanted more than whispers in the margins. They wanted legitimacy. They wanted the lie to stand beside scientific fact, to masquerade as truth itself. That would require the next phase, a full-scale operation to cloak the disinformation in the language of research, to dress the fabrication in the trappings of science. But before that escalation, the damage was already visible. In Africa, medical outreach programs stumbled against resistance. In Washington, officials scrambled to contain not only the epidemic, but the narrative itself. And in Moscow, the KGB watched with quiet satisfaction as their seedling grew into a forest of suspicion. What they had discovered was terrifying in its simplicity. You didn't need to invent a weapon to harm your enemy. All you needed was a story and the patience to watch it spread. The question now was how far they were willing to take it. By 1986, the whisper had already become a rumor, and the rumor a conspiracy. But for the Soviet intelligence services, this was only the first stage. A rumor was useful, yes, but a rumor could always be dismissed as gossip. To truly weaponize the lie, they needed something far more dangerous, the appearance of legitimacy. Enter Jakob Siegel. Siegel was not a household name, nor a towering figure in the world of medicine. He was a retired biology professor living in East Berlin, with little recognition outside his modest academic circle. But he and his wife Lily were precisely the kind of figures the KGB loved to exploit. Educated, credentialed, sympathetic to Soviet ideology, and above all, willing. The Siegels were not spies in the cloak and dagger sense. They were messengers, chosen to deliver a carefully constructed narrative under the guise of science. In the summer of 1986, a pamphlet began to circulate across East Germany and beyond. It bore an ominous title, AIDS, Its Nature and Origin. Written by Jakob and Lily Siegel, it claimed to offer scientific proof that the HIV virus had not emerged naturally, but had been engineered at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Research Center. The pamphlet was dense, peppered with scientific jargon, citations, and the careful tone of academic certainty. For the average reader, it carried the authority of research. For the Soviets, it was gold. The pamphlet alleged that HIV had been constructed by combining the genetic material of two other viruses, Visna, which infected sheep, and human T-cell leukemia virus, HTLV. Such a fusion, the Siegels argued, could only have been accomplished in a laboratory. And not just any laboratory, Fort Detrick, the very facility that the Patriot article years earlier had pointed to. The narrative loop was now complete. The obscure Indian newspaper had planted the seed, and the Siegels' pamphlet provided the scientific roots. What the pamphlet lacked in actual evidence, it made up for in confidence. It spoke with the authority of fact, while hiding behind a fog of complexity. Most readers had neither the expertise nor the means to verify the claims. But in the court of public opinion, the appearance of science was as good as science itself. The KGB moved quickly to amplify it. Copies of the Siegels' work were distributed not just in East Germany, but across the Soviet bloc, in Africa, and in sympathetic corners of Western Europe. Newspapers reported on the pamphlet as if it were a groundbreaking revelation. Soviet-backed radio stations devoted entire segments to the research, citing it as proof that the United States had unleashed a plague upon the world. From Berlin to Lusaka, the story grew legs. African newspapers in particular seized on the Siegels' work, citing it to bolster suspicions that had already taken root. For leaders in countries where AIDS was ravaging populations, the idea that the epidemic had been engineered as a weapon of genocide fit neatly into the existing narrative of Western exploitation. The Soviets understood the psychology at play. In a world divided by inequality and mistrust, people did not need much persuasion to believe that powerful nations might use biology as a weapon. By cloaking the story in scientific language, the Soviets transformed it from conspiracy to fact. In the United States, alarm bells finally began to ring. Analysts at the State Department's new Active Measures Working Group, an interagency task force designed to monitor and counter Soviet disinformation, traced the Siegel's pamphlet back to East Berlin. They saw the fingerprints of Operation INFEKTION all over it. But exposing the disinformation proved maddeningly difficult. Every time Washington issued a denial, the Soviets framed it as evidence of a cover-up. Every attempt to debunk the claim only seemed to harden its believers. Meanwhile, the Siegel's pamphlet was cited in ever more respectable outlets. Leftist newspapers in Western Europe republished sections of it, often without context, presenting it as a legitimate alternative theory. At conferences in Africa, delegates held up the pamphlet as proof of Western malice. The disinformation had crossed the boundary from propaganda to policy, and the human cost was devastating. In parts of Africa, where AIDS education was already fragile, the belief that HIV was a U.S. weapon undermined public health campaigns. Rumors spread that American doctors were not healers, but agents of infection. Vaccination drives were resisted. Offers of medical aid were rejected. Suspicion clouded cooperation at every turn. The epidemic claimed lives not just through the virus itself, but through the mistrust that Operation INFEKTION had deliberately sown. But Moscow was not done yet. To push the story deeper into global consciousness, the KGB began courting sympathetic scientists in the West, encouraging them to reference or even expand upon the Siegel's claims. Journals on the fringe, some pseudoscientific, others political, published articles repeating the accusation. Each new publication created a chain of citations, giving the illusion of independent confirmation. What began as one pamphlet soon looked like a chorus of scientific voices. In 1987, the campaign hit a new crescendo. A Soviet publication, Literaturnaya Gazeta, ran a major article repeating the Fort Detrick accusation, this time citing not only the Siegels, but also a supposed collection of international scientists who had verified their findings. The article was reprinted across the Soviet bloc and broadcast via Radio Moscow to audiences in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Millions heard the claim not as rumor, but as news. The genius of the operation was its self-sustaining nature. Once seeded, the story no longer required direct Soviet intervention. Journalists, activists, and even unsuspecting academics carried it forward. Each new retelling gave it a veneer of independence. And as the story spread, the KGB could step back, allowing the disinformation to live on without their fingerprints. In Washington, the frustration deepened. Officials at the State Department understood that countering the lie would require more than simple denials. They launched their own information campaign, pointing to genetic studies and epidemiological evidence that HIV had natural origins. But science moved slowly, and trust moved slower still. For many, the damage was already done. The haunting irony was this. While doctors struggled to educate the public about prevention and treatment, while communities fought stigma and despair, intelligence agencies on the other side of the world were weaponizing ignorance for political gain. In the balance were not just reputations, but lives. By the late 1980s, Operation INFEKTION had achieved its aim. The lie had taken root across continents. In Africa, suspicion of U.S. aid lingered. In Europe, the narrative fed anti-American sentiment. And in the United States itself, fringe groups adopted the theory, amplifying it in ways the Soviets could never have orchestrated alone. The Siegels, obscure academics turned unwitting weapons in a global information war, faded back into relative obscurity. But the story they fronted lived on. It became part of the cultural bloodstream, immune to eradication. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed, echoes of the Fort Detrick theory persisted, mutating into new conspiracies for new generations. The operation had proved something terrifying. Once a lie is dressed as truth, it can outlive its creators. And so, the world entered the next phase, not just of the AIDS epidemic, but of the disinformation epidemic. The rumor had now become a weapon, And that weapon was aimed not at soldiers or armies, but at the very idea of trust itself. By 1986, Washington could no longer ignore it. The AIDS disinformation campaign had spread across Africa, the Middle East, and even into the streets of Europe and America. Everywhere U.S. officials went, the same questions followed. Did you create this disease? Was the United States guilty of unleashing a plague? For a superpower, the sting was sharper than mere insult. This wasn't just an affront to national pride, it was a strategic liability. If foreign governments believed the accusations, alliances could fracture. If African leaders rejected American aid, the epidemic would worsen. And if the narrative stuck, the Soviet Union would have achieved what its military could not: global suspicion of America's moral standing. The U.S. response began quietly. Inside the State Department, a small interagency task force had been formed in 1981 to track Soviet disinformation. By 1983, as Soviet forgeries and rumors piled up, this group formalized into what became known as the Active Measures Working Group. Its mission was simple in words, but formidable in practice: expose Soviet lies, document their origins, and reveal the machinery behind them. The group was eclectic by design. It drew intelligence officers from the CIA, analysts from the NSA, diplomats from state, and even military officials from the Pentagon. They met in cramped rooms in Washington, often on Friday afternoons, piecing together fragments of information like detectives at a crime scene. Each new Soviet disinformation story, whether a forged NATO plan to invade Europe or a fake letter from the Pope, was examined, dissected, and traced. And by the mid-1980s, Operation INFEKTION was at the top of their list. But fighting disinformation was unlike any other war. The group could not simply order troops or deploy weapons. Their arsenal was transparency. Their battlefield was public opinion. And their enemy was not only Moscow's lies, but the speed and persistence with which those lies traveled. They began cataloging every appearance of the AIDS rumor, when and where it surfaced, which newspapers carried it, how it mutated as it crossed borders. The trail was unmistakable. From the Patriot article in India, to the Siegel's pamphlet in East Berlin, to Soviet bloc newspapers and African conferences, the fingerprints of Moscow were everywhere. The working group compiled dossiers, cross-referenced sources, and began publishing white papers to expose the operation. One of their first breakthroughs came in 1987. Analysts traced the Siegel's claims directly to East German intelligence support. They revealed that Jakob Siegel's research had not been conducted independently, but had been nurtured and promoted by Soviet-aligned organs. In carefully worded memos, the State Department pointed out glaring holes in the Siegel's argument. HIV's genetic structure bore no evidence of laboratory manipulation. The supposed combination of viruses was scientifically implausible, and Fort Detrick had never engaged in such research. The working group went further still. They named names. They pointed to Soviet publications like Literaturnaya Gazeta, showing how the KGB recycled the same talking points across multiple platforms. They traced the pattern of Soviet active measures, from forgeries of U.S. military documents to this most dangerous biological accusation. In essence, they began unmasking the playbook itself. But the battle was uphill. For every official U.S. denial, there was another Soviet broadcast accusing Washington of a cover-up. For every scientific paper explaining HIV's natural origins, there was another pamphlet waving pseudo-scientific jargon. And while American statements were often dry, cautious, and technical, Soviet propaganda was loud, emotional, and simple. In the marketplace of global opinion, emotion traveled faster than fact. African leaders under siege by the epidemic were torn. Some dismissed the Soviet narrative as cynical. Others, desperate for answers to a disease ravaging their populations, leaned into the theory. The seeds of suspicion were planted deep, and even when officials were unconvinced, their citizens often believed otherwise. In 1987, the battle escalated further. U.S. officials confronted their Soviet counterparts directly, demanding an end to the AIDS disinformation campaign. In Geneva, at arms control talks, American diplomats brought dossiers documenting the campaign and pressed Soviet negotiators. The Soviets denied everything, accusing Washington of paranoia. To admit the operation would have been unthinkable. It would not only expose a lie, but confirm the Soviet use of deception as statecraft. Yet, cracks began to appear. By the late 1980s, the AIDS rumor had drawn criticism even within Soviet scientific circles. Some academics, privately aware of its implausibility, bristled at being asked to support a political fabrication. And as glasnost, the new openness under Mikhail Gorbachev, began to reshape Soviet policy, the costs of continuing such an operation mounted. The disinformation had won short-term gains, but it threatened to undermine Moscow's credibility, just as it sought to present a reformed face to the world. Still, the Active Measures Working Group could not relent. They understood a vital truth. Even if the Soviets stopped tomorrow, the lie had taken on a life of its own. Their task was no longer only to confront Moscow. It was to inoculate the world against the infection of disinformation. They published public reports, briefed journalists, and sent officials across the globe to explain the truth. They presented the evidence at international conferences, not just to counter the lie, but to teach governments how disinformation worked. One veteran of the group later recalled the frustration. "You could prove the lie 100 times, he said, but once it was out there, people clung to it, and some still do." The campaign to debunk was not just intellectual, it was emotional. It required persuading people who had already been hurt by distrust. And the Soviets? They did not apologize. But quietly, gradually, the AIDS narrative receded from official propaganda outlets. By 1988, under pressure from both the United States and internal reforms, Moscow scaled back the campaign. The timing was not accidental. Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika sought cooperation with the West, not deepening hostility, and the AIDS disinformation story had become an obstacle to that effort. Yet the retreat was partial, never absolute. Echoes of the claim lingered in sympathetic newspapers, activist groups, and communities already steeped in suspicion. The Soviets had withdrawn their hand, but the lie, once seeded, no longer needed their touch. For Washington, this was a bittersweet victory. They had forced the Soviets to pull back, yes. They had documented the lie, exposed its machinery, and revealed it to the world. But they had also learned a terrifying lesson. In the war of disinformation, truth could never fully catch up, and that lesson would haunt them long after the Cold War ended. The curtain was supposed to close in the late 1980s. The Soviet Union was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Mikhail Gorbachev had declared glasnost and perestroika. The old order was fading, and with it, so it seemed, went the massive propaganda machine that had churned out lies about AIDS. But disinformation does not obey political cycles. Lies, once unleashed, rarely die. They mutate, they embed, and they resurface, sometimes decades later, dressed in the language of a new age. Operation INFEKTION was no exception. The short-term fallout was already devastating. In sub-Saharan Africa, where AIDS was tearing through communities, distrust of Western doctors hardened. Villagers whispered that vaccinations were poison, that clinics were fronts for American experiments. Health workers were shunned, sometimes attacked. The narrative planted by a KGB operation half a world away had found fertile soil in communities already scarred by colonial exploitation and medical neglect. The Soviet rumor that AIDS had been cooked up in a Pentagon lab became a lived reality for people struggling to reconcile the incomprehensible scale of the epidemic with the need for answers. And even as the Cold War waned, those seeds bore new fruit. In the early 1990s, as Nelson Mandela's South Africa emerged into democracy, whispers about Western plots to sterilize black populations circulated in the townships. In Nigeria, the idea that Western medicine was a Trojan horse for genocide fueled resistance to polio vaccination campaigns delayed by years, at the cost of tens of thousands of preventable cases. Though the Soviet Union itself had dissolved, The ghost of its disinformation haunted the developing world. But the consequences didn't stop at mistrust of medicine. Operation INFEKTION changed the playbook. Western intelligence agencies, once skeptical that propaganda could have such enduring force, were forced to recognize that lies could outlive the governments that created them. The Active Measures Working Group had dismantled the AIDS rumor in the press, published reports, and even won a strange kind of moral victory. Yet when those same officials looked back, they admitted something chilling. They had put out the fire in Washington and London, but the blaze raged on in Nairobi, Lagos, Kinshasa. And worse, it had already become part of popular consciousness. A disinformation campaign that started with a single planted letter in an Indian newspaper had morphed into what we'd now call a meme. Self-replicating, borderless, and indifferent to fact-checking. The truth, that AIDS originated through zoonotic transmission, not Pentagon scientists, struggled to keep pace with the far more sinister, far more emotionally satisfying fiction that it was man-made. Conspiracy theories provide what science often cannot, a villain. And villains are easier to hate than viruses. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the shadow of Operation INFEKTION looms larger still. During the COVID-19 pandemic, as debates raged over origins and vaccines, a familiar set of narratives resurfaced. Social media was suddenly flooded with claims that the virus was engineered, that governments were hiding its true purpose, that vaccines were nothing more than control mechanisms. Journalists and historians of disinformation were quick to point out the DNA of those rumors could be traced directly back to Operation INFEKTION. The Pentagon-created AIDS lie had paved the way for a culture where government health advice is suspect, where international organizations like the WHO are viewed through the lens of espionage rather than science. Even the tactics felt eerily familiar. In the 1980s, the KGB had relied on friendly journalists, obscure scientific experts, and the slow burn of rumor to turn fiction into accepted fact. By the 2020s, digital platforms had replaced print papers, and bot networks replaced sympathetic editors. But the mechanics remained unchanged. A lie seated in one place is amplified until it becomes indistinguishable from organic belief. The moral consequences are perhaps the most unsettling. Operation INFEKTION taught authoritarian states, non-state actors, and opportunists of every stripe that you don't need to destroy a rival with bombs or bullets. You just need to hollow out their credibility, to salt the ground of public trust until every message, even the truthful ones, falls on poisoned soil. If AIDS disinformation could ripple across continents, what couldn't? Climate denial, election interference, vaccine skepticism, all owe a debt to the playbook refined in the 1980s. And yet, the story has another bitter twist. When the Soviet Union finally crumbled, some of the very people who had engineered Operation INFEKTION admitted, in quiet interviews and memoirs, that they had created a monster they could not control. A retired KGB general reportedly confessed that he hadn't expected the AIDS rumor to run so far. Another lamented that even as Moscow tried to dial down the campaign in the late 1980s, the story had escaped, living its own life in the imaginations of millions. They had created a narrative virus, one more infectious than the disease it described. The fallout wasn't just geopolitical or medical, it was deeply human. Families in Africa turned away aid workers who might have prolonged their loved ones' lives. Trust in science eroded in places where it was most desperately needed. And in the United States, communities already marginalized, LGBTQ individuals, Black Americans, had to contend not just with the brutality of the epidemic, but with the weight of a foreign government's cynical attempt to weaponize their suffering for political gain. By the 1990s, when Western newspapers revisited the AIDS disinformation saga, there was a sense of disbelief. Could it really be true that one of the world's great powers had poured millions into convincing the world that its enemy had engineered a plague? But the evidence was irrefutable, thanks to the painstaking documentation of the Active Measures Working Group. The Soviet fingerprints were everywhere. The Indian letter, the East German pseudoscience, the carefully timed echoes in African newspapers, the Soviet press amplifications, a mosaic of lies. And yet, even today, if you ask in certain corners of the world where AIDS came from, the old answer will sometimes emerge: America. The disinformation still lingers like radiation after a bomb, invisible but deadly. So the final consequence of Operation Infection is not merely historical. It is ongoing. It is every hesitant parent who refuses a vaccine because they suspect a hidden agenda. It is every online forum where a scientific debate is derailed by an echo of Cold War propaganda. It is every authoritarian regime that learned the lesson: if you can't beat your rival's army, beat their truth. The disinformation factory may have shut down in Lubyanka Square, but its products continue to circulate. Operation Infection was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new era, one in which trust itself is the battlefield, and truth is the most fragile casualty. And perhaps that is the most chilling consequence of all, that a rumor planted in a small Indian newspaper in 1983 still echoes in our world today, whispering that science lies, that medicine kills, and that somewhere, unseen hands are always pulling the strings. The lie began with ink on paper, a short letter buried in the pages of a newspaper half a world away. It was small, almost invisible at first, and yet, like a drop of poison in a well, it spread until millions drank from it. Operation Infection is long over. The architects of the campaign are gone, their offices empty, their files scattered to archives. But the story didn't end when the Soviet Union collapsed. Because lies don't collapse. They linger. They evolve. Today, we live in a world saturated with information. More access, more voices, more data than at any point in human history. But with that comes something darker. More noise, more distortion, more shadow. The same tools that connected us also became conduits for deception. What once required agents, printers, and carefully orchestrated leaks now requires only a keyboard, a bot network, and the patience to watch the rumor take flight. And so, the echo of Operation Infection is all around us. In the doubt that creeps into every debate about vaccines, in the cynicism that greets scientists and doctors who warn of danger, in the half-truths and headlines that ricochet across social media before truth has even woken up. The Cold War is over, but the battlefield it opened, the war over trust, has only grown wider, noisier, more dangerous. Think about it. A single lie crafted in a room in Moscow 40 years ago can still ripple into your timeline today. If that was possible then, what's possible now? What happens when AI can fabricate a voice, a face, a document indistinguishable from reality? What happens when propaganda isn't planted by spies, but by algorithms tuned to exploit the darkest corners of our fears? This is the legacy of Operation Infection. Not just the mistrust of medicine, not just the conspiracy theories that refuse to die, but a warning etched into history that truth is never safe, that trust can be shattered, and that the most powerful weapons are often invisible. So, as you turn off this documentary and return to your world, your news feeds, your conversations, your choices, ask yourself, when the next great disinformation campaign comes, will you recognize it? Or will you drink from the poisoned well, unaware that history has already taught us how deep the poison runs? Because the war for truth didn't end in 1989, it's still here, and you're standing on its front lines.